Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's episode 19 of The Pick List. Another week has flown by. How has your week gone?
Hello. Yes, very well, thank you. Lots and lots of writing for me at the moment. I'm in a proper writing phase, so churning out lots of words, but all on very exciting stuff. So it's good fun. How's your week been?
Yeah, a huge week for me, really. So we've had the Meet Business Women Leading Change conference, which has been for the UK and Ireland community. And as I've alluded to a few weeks running, it's been a huge amount of work to try and run a virtual conference. And I'm so delighted with the feedback that we've had. We've had amazing feedback and we managed to keep everyone engaged and everyone networking, which can often be hard when you're looking at a screen. So that's great. And at the conference, we launched our global report, gender representation in the meat industry, which has been almost a year in the making, talking about how many women working in the meat industry. So yeah, big week for us at Meat Business Women. Need to go back to the day job soon.
I can imagine, and I've been really interested to see people's reactions on social media as well. I think there've been so many tweets and posts on LinkedIn about people being really excited about the conference and also the goodie bag you put together for everyone. I think it was a particularly thoughtful and interesting goodie bag you put together there.
It's all about the merch. We've got a fantastic pick list, haven't we?
We do indeed. We're joined this week by Huw Llewellyn-Waters from MBS Group. Huw has a really interesting perspective on food and grocery because, of course, he deals with it or looks at it very much from a talent point of view, senior talent in particular. But it means that he has a bird's eye view on all sorts of different interesting parts of the industry. And he brought some very interesting articles for us to discuss as well.
Should we start the show?
Huw, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners how you're connected to food and grocery?
Sure. So my name's Huw Llewellyn-Waters, and I'm a director at the MBS Group, which is a global executive search firm, specialises in the consumer-facing industries, and I lead our global consumer goods practice, which means I do a lot of advisory work with global branded corporate food businesses, as well as private label manufacturers, and then some really interesting high growth, disruptive, entrepreneurial, often private equity backed organizations as well. And I've been doing that for 10 years. And we do a lot of work specifically within food. So we'll be working with the UK supermarkets, with their suppliers, and helping them from a talent perspective at the senior leadership level, ensuring that they have the right skill sets to navigate whatever specific challenges they might be facing. And that's my day job. And then on a personal note, I'm from Wales. I grew up in rural countryside Wales, surrounded by farms. So I think from an early age, I've seen sort of the food industry in action. And I know how much hard work goes into it to make sure you get the food on your plate and everything that goes with that. So it's a real privilege now in my adult career sort of just to serve the sector as I try to do.
Fantastic. Why don't you tell us about the first article you've picked for us?
Yeah, so the first article, it's a real feel-good story. So I picked something from the Grocer, which is about two co-op employees who've been recognised in the birthday honours for their services during the COVID crisis. And these were two individuals, a lady called Liz McLean, who's a store manager, and her colleague Jean-Marie Hughes. Now, together, those two individuals, they're doing different things within the co-op, but between them, they've done various great things. So what they've managed to do is for elderly and vulnerable people who are unable to visit stores, they ensured there were delivery services available to them. They did a lot of work with food banks, making sure there was as limited food waste as possible. And they're also then going above and beyond to make sure the actual internal processes worked at Co-op, so we would have food on our shelves, which was especially important during the stockpiling we saw earlier on in the crisis. The reason I picked this, I think was sort of twofold. Really, one specifically for the Co-op. I think this is really worthy recognition of what the Co-op has been doing in the last 6 months. You know, from what I talked earlier, those individuals making sure the nation is fed, as have many other retailers, but the Co-op really going above and beyond and working with food charities and doing those great things. But also within the last 6 months specifically, not related to COVID, but the wider social contribution that the Co-op's been doing. And so, for example, Steve Morell's group CEO, I think he was the first UK retail boss to publicly condemn the murder of George Floyd. And I think, it's suitable timing. We're in October, it's Black History Month. The issues of D&I with the movement of BLM has been a big thing for the sector. And so I think it's quite incredible that you see businesses like the Co-op taking a proactive stance on wider social issues. And I think what was nice about this is that you see that clear sense of purpose running all the way from the CEO right the way down to the shop floor. So I thought it was a great recognition of the Co-op. And the second reason I chose it, I think more broadly than that, it's recognition of unsung heroes. And I think these are two supermarket workers who went above and beyond what they're paid to do, just to ensure that people were being fed and looked after. And I think that's really significant. They're not celebrities, they're not Joe Wicks or Marcus Rashford, who obviously done great things as well, but they're just ordinary people. And so I think that was really inspiring. And I think the impact of that is quite important in terms of elevating the prestige of the industry. We've seen things like key worker status coming in, and I think improving the standing and showing how integral these individuals are to the working of the nation. And then just from my perspective, from a talent perspective, it's something I come up against, the attractiveness of the sector, because 20 years ago, the best and brightest on the milk round, one of their first point of calls was the food industry. And that's still the case today, but I think somewhat diluted, particularly in the last 10 years, where you've had new and sexy sectors come in. We're going to talk about some of them in the digital space. And so there's a risk of draining of talent. So when you get an article like this and you get real recognition of key workers, I think it's wonderfully celebrating what they're doing, and hopefully it's encouraging the next generation to be proud to work in the food industry. And it's just a great advert for the sector and the role models within it. So that's why I picked it.
I totally agree. It's a fantastic article. And I saw Steve Morell tweeting about it earlier this week, actually, and I glanced at it and I thought, how fantastic, as you say, those values from the top. And you see Jo Whitfield very much in this space as well, don't you? She's always championing, I guess, the Usdaw case and the violence against shop workers, and how much these folks are becoming heroes to us to keep us fed. And I know we've previously spoken about this on other episodes, that shop work and working grocery isn't perceived as sexy, and this is a huge challenge, as you know too well, Huw, to get talent into it. But giving accolation for these folks that have done above and beyond is absolutely phenomenal, and it's great to have them front and centre for sure.
And Huw, I was really interested in what you were saying about diversity and inclusion, of course, being such a live topic in every sector, but in grocery as well, and in the food industry. When you are tasked to find talent for, typically very senior positions, and we know there has been plenty of criticism of the food industry and grocery around the lack of diversity, particularly in those higher positions. Are you seeing that is changing? Is different talent being put forward? Are we making progress on that front?
I think we are. Fundamentally, I think there's been a big shift in mindset, and businesses are taking seriously. It's no longer a box-ticking exercise, diversity inclusion. It's becoming increasingly central to the business's strategy. It's becoming business critical. I think organizations have started to realize that they need to reflect their customer base authentically to really get through, and they need to bring in diverse thinking to tackle groupthink and problem solve more effectively. So I think we are making progress. I think it is relatively slow progress, though. If you look at some of the stats in recent years, it's relatively stilted. And I think the biggest challenges are, and when we're tasked to find people, there's certain functions where finance, operations, where there's a general perception you can't get a diverse shortlist. There aren't enough women, specifically on gender, in those functions. That is a myth that I think needs to be debunked quite aggressively. And I think it's where myself and my counterparts in the recruiting industry need to have accountability as well. You need to, from an external perspective, always be presenting, being creative with how you find that diverse talent. So we are making progress, but as Laura knows, there's a long way to go still.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
So my first pick this week is from the Sunday Times, and it's an article titled "Automated Stores Are Heading for the High Street." It's a piece essentially about what's also known as unattended retail. So stores, but also sometimes shelves and fridge units where shoppers can buy items without interacting with any staff. It's an area that really interests me for a number of reasons, one of which, as Laura will know, is the fact that I recently wrote an article about next generation vending machines, which sort of touches on a lot of the same issues. But also, of course, we're looking at this in the context of the pandemic, where contactless retail, reducing the need for interacting with store staff, is suddenly very, very relevant. So what's the Sunday Times' take on it? Well, this piece was written by their West Coast correspondent, so it has a US focus to it. And in particular, it talks about a San Francisco startup called Standard Cognition, which has developed a cashierless checkout system, which sounds very much like Amazon Go. But the key difference here, as the article points out, is that the Standard Cognition system can be retrofitted pretty much anywhere. So it's opening up a whole range of potential locations to suddenly offer contactless retail. The article talks about university canteens, for example, but you could also potentially imagine this in a supermarket car park or a housing complex or a workplace, of course. And the vision that the guys at Standard Cognition have is that you can essentially treat these stores like your personal pantry. And what they're saying is, just grab what you want, leave, and stop worrying about this being a transactional moment. And there's all sorts of quite clever technology that allows that to happen. So essentially, with this particular system, you shop through an app, which the customer has to download, and you then basically use that to check into the store. And there you have cameras that capture what people pick up, and you've got really clever algorithms that basically work out what your hand movements mean. Are you just browsing? Are you just looking at something? Or have you actually picked something up that you're looking to buy? And that information is then cross-referenced against a database of all the products in the store. So the system can essentially determine what you have bought and then charge your account. It's terribly clever. And this particular startup, are claiming that it's about to go mainstream, but there are certainly some challenges. Cost is a big one. It's still pretty steep. The article talks about a convenience store installation costing about 50 grand plus a monthly service fee. So that's not going to be an option for many people. And then, of course, there is that people element here. The retail sector, Huw just talked about, people in the retail sector being recognized. There are lots of people that are employed here. Is it desirable? Is it even ethical to look to do these people out of a job at the moment, especially in the current climate? There are also some concerns about privacy, because you need to have a lot of cameras to make sense of what people are buying. So there's lots of camera use. So moving to these systems isn't necessarily a slam dunk, but I think it's certainly an interesting direction that we're seeing loads and loads of discussion around at the moment. I have to say, though, after reading the article, I was left thinking that, smart vending machines, something that's perhaps not quite as technologically advanced as some of the systems that are being talked about here, but, the next generation of really sophisticated vending machines that do so much more than, sell you a packet of crisps or a chocolate bar. It just feels like they are perhaps able to do a lot of what these more complicated concepts allow you to do, but in a way where the technology is here right now and not quite as expensive. Huw, what did you make of it?
It's a fascinating read, and as you said, it's super clever and feels incredibly relevant given the crisis of the last 6 months. I think the two things jumped out to me. One you've covered off is it's the suggested redundancies, and I think I read that the founders were very quick to promise this wouldn't mean thousands of layoffs. I struggle to see how that couldn't be the case. They talked about it being the end of the cashier role. You still have to find a home for those, however many people would lose their jobs. So that was something that jumped out. But I suppose we're always going to have that to a degree with technical innovation. One thing it reminds me of, though, is that sort of if you think back to when we had SARS in the world, obviously in Asia, that's where you saw this sort of innovation. So organizations like Alibaba, like JD.com, the real pioneers of e-commerce and online shopping, that came out of a crisis like that. So because it was very relevant to the subject, so it felt like there was some good synergy. So it felt like there's a lot of weight in it. But yeah, I couldn't work out how they could justify or how they could explain away that there wouldn't be so many redundancies through the innovation.
And I guess when they're spending that much to make it all automated, then someone's going to have to restock the shelves. So is that maybe what they're thinking? We'll keep staff for that, but obviously you don't need as many staff just as that. And I always think for the smaller footprint stores, that it is so expensive. Does the turnover of those stores justify that cost? But then the bigger stores, realistically, you're probably happier to do a self-check or you're happy to run through a checkout rather than if you're pushing a big trolley round. Really interesting.
It's an interesting point you raise in terms of that replenishment. When I had conversations for my article, which, as I said, wasn't really about these sort of very advanced unattended retail concepts, much more about more kind of typical vending, albeit in a more sophisticated way. There definitely was that sense that actually this doesn't necessarily mean that there's a net job loss. Because you do need to have people who are managing these systems, as you say, stock replenishment. If you want this to be sophisticated and you want people to buy into this, you can't be constantly running out of stock. So you do potentially still need people. As you say, though, you need them in different roles, and how easy it is to then transfer people across, how easy it is to get people trained up on these different roles, I think is a totally different matter. But certainly what they were saying in the article, which is that it doesn't necessarily mean there's mass redundancies, that was echoed in the conversations I had, just because these are still quite demanding systems that require quite a lot of manpower for replenishment and stock management. Laura, what's your first pick this week?
My first pick this week is from the Grocer, and it's the big interview. And as you know, I love the big interview because people buy from people, and I like finding what makes those people tick. So this week it's an interview with Karen Betts, and she's been CEO of the Scotch Whisky Association for the last 3 years. Really interesting background. She's a diplomat by trade and was previously a British ambassador to Morocco. So, and you always think, God, how do those two worlds meet? Well, when you're reading through the article, it's interesting, and I guess it's been across the news for some time that Scotch whisky has been heavily challenged by tariffs, particularly in the US. They've got a 25% tariff on single malt at the moment, which is costing the Scotch industry an estimated 30 million a week. So having a diplomat at the helm is really helping that. And she was heavily involved with some trade negotiations when she was in government. And I guess pressuring government now, it links in the article. And I don't know about you, but when I get asked the question at the moment, what box sets are you watching? And I sort of think, oh, well, not many really, because I'm just watching the news and I'm, loving what's coming on in the news in terms of, I guess, the US story, and it's the US election. And I suppose it's better than a soap opera to a degree. And she touches on this and gives a really interesting piece of insight that they're pushing hard to try and get an agreement around these tariffs are on single malt pre-election. And she feels if this doesn't happen pre-presidential election at the beginning of November, then they'll be left arguably even with a Trump team that could evolve, or a totally new team, and it's going to be parked until early next year. So it was a really interesting article in that respect, and how she says that trade negotiation is not going to resolve disputes, and the US government have been very clear about that. And it talks about how she's been over to the US pre-COVID and trying to understand their position. So it's all, as I say, people buy from people, and her diplomatic skills. What the Grocer have done, and Henry Holmes has done a really cute job here. He leads into the fact that she's been appointed by Liz Truss as a sounding board to the new independent trade policy, the government advisory group, Board of Trade. And there was a lot of press around this at the time, wasn't there, when Tony Abbott was appointed, in terms of his views when he was Australian Prime Minister around homophobia. And is he potentially misogynistic? And there was a lot of comments in the press about that. So she gets asked this, and unsurprisingly, she refuses to directly answer that question, but talks positively about, there's a lot of female membership on that committee, and it then leads into talking about sexism within the whisky industry. And there's been, I think, a lot of chat in the whisky industry recently about it, and she calls it out in terms of it can be seen as a macho domain. And actually debate is a good thing, and how the Scotch Whisky Association has a new diversity charter to try and push to have 50-50 gender balance in the forthcoming years. But she's really open and honest that they do have potentially outdated views in the sector, and how working in a distillery is still seen as potentially a male-orientated job because you need to be strong and fit and ideally a guy. Unsurprisingly, you both know the reason I picked this is because I work heavily in the meat industry and saw a lot of reflection from what we try and achieve with meat businesswomen and our new report this week, and I guess what she's seeing in the whisky industry and maybe more broadly in the alcohol industry. What do you think, Huw? Is it an alcohol industry wide, or is it a whiskey focused issue? And have you come across Karen on your travels? That's my other question. I'm intrigued because she sounds like a force of nature.
I haven't come across her yet, but I would love to. She sounds a very interesting individual, and like you, I loved her story and her background, and it feels like she's the good sort of person to be challenging these kind of these stigmas attached to it. I think in terms of does it apply to the wider alcohol industry? Yes and no. I think you see a lot of prestigious large alcohol businesses that are actually incredibly progressed in terms of their diversity and inclusion agenda. I think I would actually put out Diageo is probably one of the most informed and well-versed businesses when it comes to D&I. I think that said, more from a macro perspective, I think within beer, there's been a similar misconception, and at a grassroots level in terms of employment, you have to crawl around, you have to fit pipes. Is this attractive? Is this attractive work? Assumedly for women. The challenge to that, though, and it's quite interesting, if you look to Eastern Europe, and if you look to a lot of the investment they did in education about 20, 30 years ago, it was heavily into women going into STEM, so science, technical engineering and maths and so on. And as a result, they have a huge amount of female engineers, and there's not the same level of perception. So I think it's quite an easy throwaway excuse that it's not attractive to women. There just hasn't been the investment in changing that perception. And I think you definitely see that with the whiskey industry. I mean, some of the whiskey businesses we advise, I won't say which ones, but they're planning to do a major renaissance around whiskey, really challenge the state, the positioning of it, that it's not such a homogeneously focused white male middle class drink, but rather try and open up the female consumer or open up the youth consumer. But to do that, you really need to bring in more diverse thinking.
Huw, tell us about your second pick for us.
So my second pick is from a publication called Sifted, and it's about Octopus Ventures, who are focusing more on consumer startups. Now, Octopus Ventures is a venture capital fund that invests in small but budding, innovative, disruptive businesses, and they've invested in the likes of Zoopla, Graze, Secret Escapes, which we all know have been massive successes. So clearly a savvy bunch and know what they're doing. So it's quite interesting to look to where their focus is. And obviously with their focus being more so on consumer startups, I think it's very encouraging for many reasons. But what they say in the article is that COVID has obviously increased online shopping, particularly grocery shopping. And they use a statistic that I think in the UK e-commerce jumped from 20% to 30%. And they don't anticipate that 30% receding when COVID recedes either. And so what they're envisioning and what is currently happening, is pretty obvious as well, is a serious rewiring of the big retailers and opening up opportunity for opportunistic startups who are going to come in and try and take some of those customers. Also quite interesting that they're specifically focusing on startups that provide healthy and good eating choices, and with the sustainability edge focused on the climate and planet. But the reason I picked the article is one bit really sort of jumped out at me, and it was when they used the analogy, or they likened what happened to Grays, where about 10 years or so ago there was a strike at the Royal Mail, which meant that Grays had to shift their business model entirely to do something different. And by doing that, that was the model that obviously allowed Grays to be what it is today. So through that adversity was a huge opportunity, and you know, they were massively successful and recently sold to Unilever for a very large amount of money. And so the article, what it meant to me was, you know, there's opportunity in this crisis. But I think the confidence of looking at venture capital and private equity, increased investment in the consumer space is a really important one. My colleagues and I have been talking to a number of partners at private equity funds over the last 6 months, trying to assess what the appetite is for investment and also where they intend to put their money. And I think what's been really encouraging is that certainly the consumer space, and their strategy hasn't changed either. So they're not going after distressed businesses who have been hit bad by COVID, but rather they're continuing to invest in good business propositions with good businesses models and strong agility. And I think that's super important and really encouraging, because private equity and venture capital is often a very reliable weather vane for where there's opportunity and commercial success. So there's a lot of optimism there. And I think ultimately what this is probably going to lead us to is a new era of intense and increased innovation. I likened earlier, you know, what happened after SARS with Alibaba and JD.com. I think you're going to see something quite similar now worldwide. So I think it's super exciting. You know, COVID doesn't seem to intrinsically change anything, rather acted as quite an aggressive catalyst for already existing change. So it's just exciting to see where the VC and PE guys are going to continue to put their money and what phoenixes are going to arise in the coming years.
Yeah, totally. I thought it was very interesting to hear where they're focusing in terms of some of the targets that they're pursuing. And as you said, no surprise, anything with a kind of direct to consumer angle, anything that's got a clear, you know, on well-established or at least promising online sales channel is obviously incredibly relevant, as is that focus on health. I am really intrigued to see just how much interest there is once again in D2C, because pre-COVID, that D2C model did have its challenges, and we were starting to see quite a bit of commentary, weren't we, of people saying, you know, yes, D2C has a lot of promise, but it's also quite crowded, it's quite noisy. There are lots of businesses that have very clever marketing, but then don't seem to have necessarily a business that is scalable or profitable. We'd started seeing some of these sort of almost like umbrella companies, you know, acting as brand houses within D2C. So I'll be really interested to see whether what we have seen, this jump in e-commerce, whether that has made a fundamental difference to the scalability and profitability of some of these businesses, or whether in a few months' time we're going to start regurgitating or revisiting some of these original challenges around some of those D2C businesses as well.
I think it's a really good reservation. I think speaking to a lot of the digital businesses, what they're excited by is the conversion of shoppers who hadn't been online shoppers. You know, if you think about the Silver Surfer, so the older generations who might have been nervous about shopping online, they've been forced to through COVID. And I know on a personal level, you know, talking to my parents, you know, to suddenly discover the wonder and the convenience of it, they're converts. And that's not going to recede. So you have seen a fundamental shift of people now going to be actively looking for online shopping. So I think it's going to be absolutely vital to have a strong digital capability going forward. And if there are traditional businesses that have different routes to market, they need to pivot very aggressively to make sure that they're going to keep ahead of anyone coming into the space and taking market share from them.
Yeah, and I think it's a useful distinction, actually, thinking about a strong digital capability, which isn't necessarily a D2C capability, is it? Because, I think a lot of these silver surfers, or a lot of these new customers, yes, some of them will be in the market for more adventurous shopping and looking for those direct relationships with brands, but a lot of that increased interest in e-commerce will be funneled through those big established retailer names. But of course, yeah, having a product, having packaging, having everything that means you can perform well within e-commerce has never been more relevant.
It feels like it gives me hope, really, that they're out there looking for all these crazy ideas, and I get that it feels like the rules have changed as well a little bit, as you say, Julia. It's about, is it digital first to a degree for some products and some initiatives. So yeah, it felt a real positive article.
I think so. I think it's quite an exciting article. I think both the articles I picked were quite optimistic and exciting.
Yeah.
Positive spin.
Julia, what's your second pick this week?
So my second pick is from the FT, and I think we're continuing the positive spin and the sense of excitement and possibility with that as well. So this is an article titled "Flies Lead the Way to a Greener Future," and it's an opinion column by John Thornhill, who's the FT's innovation editor. And as the title suggests, it's about insect protein, which is just such an interesting area at the moment. We've talked about it quite a bit here on the podcast, but there's so much investment happening at the moment, lots of innovation. So I was immediately drawn to this piece because I think it just speaks to a lot of what we're seeing in the market at the moment. What Jonathan argues in this piece is that we're looking at a potential second agricultural revolution here, one that will put the food and farming sector on a much more sustainable path. And what's so exciting about insects in a way, and black soldier flies in particular, they get quite a lot of coverage in this piece, is their ability to be converted into protein, of course, particularly at the moment for feed rather than necessarily for consumer products, but also the fact that they feed on waste. So you're looking at a solution to two very pressing issues for the food industry: sustainable protein, but also feed waste. And the black soldier fly sort of outperforms on that front. The article quotes Jason Drew, who's chief executive of Agri Protein, as describing the black soldier fly as not a fussy eater, which is exactly what you want in a fly or in an insect if you're looking at it from a protein conversion point of view, but also from a food waste point of view. Interestingly, actually, with there being so much focus on food waste reduction at the moment, and we've just seen Tesco launch a really major initiative on that front as well, one of the challenges companies like Agri Protein now face actually is finding a reliable source of food waste that they can use. There are also some challenges still around scalability, not just because of the challenge around finding the right waste sources, but also because there's some uncertainty around government regulations for that sector still. So the article makes clear that none of this is about sort of finding a silver bullet solution, but it does just have that potential to amount to something really quite exciting, and to sort of echo what Huw was saying about that sense of optimism and innovation. And yes, there are opportunities here as well. I think that sector, the whole insect protein sector, really ticks a lot of exciting boxes at the moment. And I suppose the level of investment we're seeing at the moment as well. I mean, Yinsect is the most recent example of a company in this space that's attracted quite hefty investment. It just goes to show that this really is an area that's being taken quite seriously, not just by people with an interest in sustainability, but increasingly investors as well. Huw, what did you make of it? And does the idea of having insects play a bigger role within our food and farming system, is that something that excites you?
Amazingly so. I thought this was the best article of the bunch, if you don't mind me saying. I really enjoyed reading this one. You can probably see sort of it gets the geeky side of me exciting. So I thought it was just so innovative. It was just so smart, and super relevant. For the reasons you've shared. I think anything that's around sustainability, around a more responsible use of our food industry. I think the article quotes how much damage the food industry has also done to the climate. So anything that can tackle that, I think is super inspiring. The fact it's also on top of that tackling food waste is something that's quite close to my heart. I think I try and support as much as I can a lot of the food charities and initiatives in the UK. And there's one charity that told me a statistic that of the surplus food in the UK, only 7% is repurposed. So 93% goes to waste. And the UK, for a rich country, is living with serious food poverty in certain communities, which is, and I know international people, when they come to the UK, are shocked by it, given the relative wealth. So food waste is a huge issue. So this was the bringing together of two great ideas. I just got very excited by it. I think I haven't had the pleasure of working with insects or fly businesses before, but I have done a lot of advisory work in the vertical farm space. And I think what's really encouraging for businesses with this type of agenda is that people are bought in very, very quickly. Consumers and the people that will bring in that technology. So that if funding it gets, you can walk into an in vertical farming, you can walk into an Amazon, you can walk into a Tesco or a Carrefour, and they will find a way to support you and make use of their space and bring that in. So I think it's a huge opportunity for businesses in this space. I got very excited reading it, to be honest.
I like the article as well, because I think consumers are bought into this. When they're one removed, I think they get insect protein, and as long as there's that nervousness about would they eat it themselves, probably not, but as an ingredient or a feed or further down that supply chain, I think consumers are there and ready and getting that sustainability piece more so than they've ever been. And I guess it feels like we've almost fast-tracked to here.
Yeah, totally. And as you say, I think, obviously that consumer-facing piece is always a bit more challenging. But I think if we can make insects within animal feed supply chain something that is more normal, that's less novelty. But, obviously at the moment it still very much is in that challenger and sort of startup space. If it's something that becomes scalable and is just something that becomes a more normal part of how the food industry operates, I think there will be opportunities to bring it into something that's a bit more B2C facing as well. But yeah, probably not as an initial step.
Yeah, I don't know. If you'd asked me that sort of 5 years ago, I probably would have agreed with you. But I think just the movements, you've seen in terms of veganism, vegetarianism, and flexitarians as well, where people are actively on a moral basis, ethical basis, choosing to eat different things to what they might actually previously enjoyed, shows a really genuine big commitment to climate change and issues that are coming with us. So, I probably wouldn't have thought this 5 years ago, but just what we've seen in terms of people voting with their feet towards more ethical uses of food, maybe you will see an insects Snickers bar in the next couple of years. I think that would be absolutely fascinating.
We'll give you a ring and watch you eat it, Huw.
I'll buy one.
Excellent. Laura, what's your second pick for us?
I'm disappointed my second pick isn't Hugh's favourite article, but I'll let him off because it's got nothing to do with food. But I just really enjoyed it, so I thought I'd bring it to today's show. So it's from Charged, and it's H&M to launch high-tech Loop, and that's Loop with 3 O's, system in-store which will shred old clothes and create new ones in real time. And the reason I picked this, it's all about store theatre, and let me tell you what they're up to. So they're set to launch a cutting-edge garment-to-garment recycling system in-store which will shred old clothes, spin them into new ones in front of customers. The new Loop system will soon be launched in its flagship Stockholm store, marking the first of its time, its revolutionary garment recycling system to be revealed to the public. And I guess we talk, and we've just touched on it there, about food waste and what a huge sustainability issue that is. But when we think about fast fashion, and that does get quite a bit of press now and again, depending what the zeitgeist is, then clothing is equally as challenging. And it says this system will use no water and no chemicals, and the new technology will help transform the fashion industry and reduce dependency on virgin resources. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was they've all linked this as well to the H&M loyalty card. So not only are they going to bring in this theatre where you can take your old, let's say, t-shirt, and they're going to change it into a cardigan for you without washing it or using chemicals. This is very exciting how it's going to work, and you'll see it all happening through glass. If you're a loyalty member, then you'll get it for the equivalent of £8.73 charge, but non-members will still have access, but they'll pay £13.10. All proceeds will go towards projects related to research on materials forming part of H&M's global using of only recycled and sustainability resourced materials by 2030. So maybe this is, and I don't know, keen to get your views, a bit of a one store theatre press option, but I'm just so intrigued by the cost of this technology, and actually will it help a fast fashion retailer shift to something that, you know, like challenges we have in the grocery market, something that is more sustainable supply chains, and think us more about, well, if we don't enjoy wearing that t-shirt anymore, but it's not threadbare, take it back and they'll almost knit it into something else for you. What do you think, Huw?
Yeah, it was my second favourite article.
Good, right answer. Smooth.
It was, I mean, conceptually, it's great, isn't it? I mean, for the reasons we just talked around sustainability, and it's just really innovative and really creative thinking. So I loved the idea of it. And what I particularly liked is what you pulled out as well, is the loyalty scheme, which I thought was a super smart way to commercialise and incentivise people to be more sustainable. And it's just good business. The business succeeds out of that, and the planet becomes a better place. And you've seen good examples of that in other organisations. I don't know if you know the People Against Dirty business, where in the likes of Method and Ecova, they've now launched refillable stations in supermarkets. So you just take the bottle in, and they will refill it for, I think, a fraction of the price. And My Mustard do the same with your mustard pots as well. So and it's been proven to work. So I love the loyalty aspect of it. Your question around is this able to roll out, or is it more of a flagship? I mean, I couldn't get my head around what it actually was. So I couldn't understand how it could work on a practical basis. I think it feels like a fantastic flagship store, but I wouldn't have necessarily. I've got more belief in insect Snickers bars coming available in the next few years than perhaps seeing these in every H&M around the world.
The only other thing that I thought of, and you've alluded to it already, and when we chatted about automation, was, you know, people want to have that level of service, and are you going to a store because you want to see something different? Yeah. Is this because, you know, H&M will, as others will, continue to sell more and more online? Is this a reason to get footfall into stores that they're paying significant rent for and allocate square footage to it? What do you think, Julia?
I can certainly see that it would be a good reason to go into a store. And I think from a sort of theatre point of view, just reading the article, I wanted to see it, which I guess is sort of indicative of how good a sort of focal point it might be for a store. I'd agree with Huw to the extent that I was like, I must see this because I don't quite understand what's going on. Because presumably they must have a catalogue of designs that you can then choose from to then have your old clothes transformed into something new. I didn't quite understand how that would be managed, and how many old garments you might have to feed into this machine in order to then get a new piece of clothing out of it. So I think it's one of those things that probably needs to be seen to be believed. But I think it certainly speaks to that trend and growing sort of consumer awareness around recyclability and reusability, and wanting to move away from having disposable items. You know, fast fashion obviously has been so tarnished reputationally in recent years, and I think anything that makes consumers stop and think and feel like, no, there is residual value. This isn't just such a cheap t-shirt that I might as well just throw it in the bin because I don't think there's any value to it. But to really think about, you know, no, there are raw materials here and they still have value, and there's something exciting and valuable and new that can be created from it. So I hope it's more than just a flagship store kind of PR initiative. I'd really like to see something like that working on a bigger scale, not least so that I can go and watch it and actually understand what they're doing.
I like your idea of the catalogue. It makes me think of the old Argos catalogue.
I just immediately aged myself there, yeah.
These are the things that your T-shirt can be.
No one's looked at catalogues in about 20 years. I do appreciate that.
I didn't get that far in my thinking. I didn't think of the fact that it could be a catalogue. I thought it was almost like a surprise. So you took a T-shirt in and walked out with the jumper. I thought this could be quite a fun raffle in that respect. It's a really, really, really nice idea.
Huw, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your articles with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really interesting, really great articles, so thank you.
We've loved it.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.